Good afternoon. I'm Emmer Nile, the GIS coordinator for the Oregon Department of Forestry, and this is my Northwest GIS conference presentation for October 13th, 2020. I have a brief outline about my presentation. We talk about what does authoritative mean in terms of the GIS world. And my exhortation is that GIS users need to be skeptical when dealing with data, wherever they get it from, and especially authoritative data. And we'll deal with the perception of accuracy and precision, and reinforce that authoritative does not necessarily mean accurate. And it may be in some circumstances that crowdsourced data is more accurate or better suited for the needs. We'll talk about some examples, and then we'll also talk about dealing with addresses. From the state of Oregon, Oregon Geographic Information Council, we prepared this. I was a part of the preparation of this document, and you can see that there are several questions raised in the description of authoritative data, and it's worth asking the questions about what is the purpose of the data, authoritative data, and what should be the caveats used. So the metadata is really the critical part of managing and utilizing the data. I started using GIS data 30 years ago, and in that time we didn't have metadata, and you pretty much were lucky to get any kind of information describing the data, like a data dictionary, when you receive the data. And so I developed my own habits of taking a critical look at the data, and that's an important thing to do when looking at data and receiving it. Does it make sense in terms of context? Does it make sense in terms of, are there too many vertices? Are there too few vertices? Does this seem to line up with other featured classes that I know and trust? Does it seem to line up with other imagery? And I just have my own method of kind of validating the data, looking at the data itself, and then the data between other data sources. When we go to the FGDC definitions, they have some they have described some definitions, and if you'd like to go back to this later, hit pause, you can read these. I don't need to read them for you. So accuracy is one of the things that I like to talk about, because there's definitely a difference in needs of accuracy and precision. This story is Amelia Earhart, 1932, first woman to fly solo across the Atlantic. She had this gigantic airplane, or at least with a gigantic engine. It's very loud and noisy. She flew for hours, leaving the North American continent. She was tired. She was hungry. She was thirsty. She didn't have enough, didn't bring enough to drink. And she was flying in clouds, rough weather. She got down sometimes close to the ocean. Finally, she found a break in the clouds and saw a green field. And so she was happy for that, because she was running low on fuel, and she decided to land in the field. At this point, she didn't know if she was near her target of Paris, or if her compass had gotten messed up and she was actually back in North America. And so she was happy to be on the ground, and she met a farmer, McCallion, and she said, "Where am I?" And McCallion was honest, and he said, "In Gallagher's Field." This is a classic example of, difference of accuracy and precision. The answer was absolutely accurate. And the level of precision that Amelia Earhart was looking for was something much less accurate, like you're in Ireland. And so it's an example of people who use data may have very different accuracy and precision requirements. This is an example of a description of a high resolution data set. It's 250 meter resolution. And for the world that I live in, high accuracy is something like 1 meter resolution. And I'm certain that there are those of you who are watching this presentation that that's not high resolution. You need much higher resolution. But if you're dealing with the global scale, 250 meter is high resolution. I guess I would prefer to call that something less than high resolution, but it's an example of just the perspective that you come to when you talk about high resolution data. And that certainly is true when it comes to dealing with authoritative data. Here's an example of looking at two different satellite results. Both the MODIS and VIRS, or the Suomi satellites, have thresholds on the thermal bands to detect fires. And so here we have the fire detections for all of 2017 in McMinnville, Oregon. It's not actually a fire, this is a steel mill. And so there's a very hot heat source that triggers the sensor as a fire. And so you can see the red squares are the Suomi detections, and it's a 375 meter resolution, whereas the yellow diamonds are MODIS, which are 1 kilometer, 1,000 meters. So all we can really say is, are any of these points in the correct location? Well, the middle of the grouping is probably where the actual heat source at the fire, or at the fire or the heat caused by the steel mill. So when we have people that look at satellite detections for fires and they say, oh my gosh, it burned down this community or not. Well, that's not necessarily true. It could very easily be 1,500 feet away from the actual fire location. So you have to have caveats about what is the accuracy of the data set you're actually dealing with. Let's switch and talk about trails. In this case, we are looking at the Jefferson Park area, which recently was in the perimeter of the Lion's Head fire that burned pretty vigorously in September. And the base green is from PlanetScope imagery. And so while much of this area did have some, was burned, much of it was not, but that's not the focus here. The yellow lines are the paths from OpenStreetMap, and then the brown lines are from the National Authoritative Data Set for trails. And you can see that down in this area, the National Authoritative Data Set stops and actually is not in a line with the LiDAR trails, and as well as then the OpenStreetMap paths, as well as then out in the Bays and Scouts Lake area, the actual social trails, or the trails that are used to access many of the camping areas, are not shown in the national data set because they're not official. But if you want to actually take advantage of hiking and camping in many areas, you're better off getting an app that has offline capabilities and includes the OpenStreetMap data. Switching now to look at streams. This is in Siskiyou County, where I've worked and am very familiar with this ground. This is about 2 miles across here. You can see by the sections, and the topography is very gentle. It's probably 5 to 12% relief in the average areas, and you can see where this big canyon creek. It actually is a creek, but if you look at the NHD, the authoritative source for hydrography across the country, you can see they have added in a great number of extra lines that didn't exist on the quads. And when you look at the topography from LiDAR, then you can see there is a very distinctive water course that's shown here. And this indeed does flow water at some times throughout the year. Typically, the water flows happen after snow melt, so sometime in June or July it does flow water, but it is an intermittent stream. And then these other areas do not have any sign of flow throughout the year, and so these water courses do not exist, and they're not. You should have no evidence on the ground. So one has to be very careful, especially when creating regulations based on geospatial data sets. Switching to Dome Rock near Detroit, Oregon. This also is a area that burned last month. The OpenStreetMap data compared to the USGS Quad at the time shows the summit being in this area. And when you look at the aerial photo of the appropriate time, you can see that the summit peak, the green trail and the brown triangle show the summit at its point, and it looks right. It looks according to the rock in the area. However, when you compare to the LiDAR hillshade, you can see that the ortho photo was incorrect. There was a shift, and the summit was actually shown at the bottom of the cliff, and you can see this is faint relief of the trail in this location. And again, the LiDAR is something that can be trusted, because I've been working with LiDAR data since 1997, and I have a fairly high degree of trust, because LiDAR topography is actually a surveyed location. So my advocation for you is to always distrust any data source and do your own validation until you get a degree of confidence as to what the value of the data is. And our friend Dean Anderson has this quote. He says, "Well, authoritative data was a bad idea then." That was when we established authoritative data definitions, and it's a bad idea now. So there are no restrictions in terms of an organization producing authoritative data, and you need to be cautious when dealing with any data source. I'll switch now to talk to about some of the issues in my volunteer world. I'm a GIS Corps volunteer supporting the Crowd2Map project in Tanzania. We utilize Humanitarian OpenStreetMap, or HOT, the tasking manager, to create roads and buildings in OpenStreetMap in Tanzania. And at this point, by far, OpenStreetMap is the most comprehensive and complete data set for Tanzania, and we're continuing to work with that. The Crowd2Map does work to ensure that girls are not at risk for female genital mutilation, or FGM. And we have a network of safe houses and rescue teams that can go and help support a girl that's at risk. But if there's no map, then obviously it's very difficult to get to a location. And also, if the building isn't on the map, then you can't really know where it is. And much of the world has very little addressing or none at all. And right now there's several ways of looking at location. And so the Public Land Survey, latitude and longitude. I am a I'm not a proponent of what three words. I think it's a kind of a silly system. You have a postal address, which many places don't have. The Maidenhead grid is one utilized by the ham radio operators. Place Key is an organization who's trying to monetize addresses. And then there's also Plus Codes, which is an open source addressing scheme that works across the world. Addressing is a human right. And if you don't have an address, then there are many things that you cannot do in terms of your legal standing or being able to vote or get emergency services. So here's an example from Ethiopia, where I used to live a few years ago. The address for this business, Great Abyssinia PLC, is behind Bole Medehanalam Church in Bole, which is in central Ethiopia. There are no addresses, and this is as close as one gets to an address there. The town I lived in had nearly 500,000 people, and not one of the streets had a name, and then there were no street numbers for any of the houses there. So it's quite a challenge. So let me show an example. I picked a random place in Zurich, or near Zurich in Switzerland. And so Zurich is right in this, kind of the central north part of Switzerland. And I picked this Heiterbergstrasse number 1 and the mailing address. And here's the postal code. It has a latitude and longitude. And then the military grid reference system is one that is not really a grid, because where the UTM zones converge, they become triangles, but this is the grid for this location. And the military spends a lot of time training their people how to use this system, but it's not terribly user friendly. The what three words dummy passages grew. There's no intelligence to that, and if you aren't connected to the internet, then or their server, then you can't get this. So it obviously doesn't work in developing countries where there's limited internet connection, or in wilderness areas. So I think that what three words is pretty absurd. And it's also, because someone's trying to monetize an address. And, there's plenty of things that you can make money at, but an address is not one of those. Placekey.io is a new one that's coming out with a really complicated looking universal address, but it's not universal, and the source code is not available. Open location codes, also known as plus codes, was created by Google. And so for that reason, many people think it's bad, but they've completely published the source code for it. And it fits into, you can calculate the values of open location codes using ArcGIS or Pro. I've used it in QGIS. It works very easily. So let me zoom through some examples of that example place in Switzerland. Here's the Maidenhead grid. This is what a plus code 8-digit looks like. You can see the size. So it's like a neighborhood. If you zoom in to a specific house, in this case, number 1, you can see that there are 4 or 5 plus code addresses actually in this location. So it's a higher resolution than, say, a street address. And so if you wanted to have lumber delivered to one of these, a specific part of your yard, you could have that, you could give that plus code address. And then if you actually just type in 99xg plus 5g, if in that vicinity, Google will take you there. And or you could have a one of the available open source tools that you can download for free. Switching to a completely another part of the world where I used to live when I was in the Peace Corps, Fale-Latai. This is the house that I used to live in, and this address if you type it in to your on your phone, either just Google Maps or on one of the open source apps, it will take you right to the front door of this house. You don't have to know the name of the people. You could just take you right there. So it's extremely user friendly, open source tool, which I guess I can't fault people for not liking Google, but in this case, they actually did a really great job of creating a simple to use base 20 tool that anyone can use. And for the people that want to monetize addresses, I don't think that's a good idea. So to summarize, GIS professionals need to evaluate data quality before you use it. Authoritative GIS data is not necessarily the most accurate or complete or the best. And the accuracy that a publisher uses may mean something completely different than what you as a consumer use. And addresses are a human right, and commercial addressing schemes really aren't necessarily all that helpful for the powerless. And at this point now, we will complete the show and we'll ask for questions.